Ko mangatua te manga, ko taere te awa, no o te poti aho, that's Dunedin. No, ko toku ingoa Suzanne Watt, tēnā koutou katoa. Over the past 2 days of this conference, we've heard a lot about our climate crisis. We've seen the banners outside the Aotea Centre calling for climate action. We've heard the science telling us that we need to act and that the time to act is now. We also know that we have to act fast to preserve what we have left of our environment. We've heard about finance, we've heard about risk, we've heard about insurance, the carbon markets, collaboration, supply chains. And of course, this wouldn't be complete without a little bit of politics thrown in there. And some might say perhaps for a little bit of entertainment. But of course, some serious messaging and important policies and approaches that we need to know about. By far, the majority of our conversations have been about how to manage our climate risk, how we decarbonise, how we achieve our goals, and how we do so without greenwashing. But what I'm saying to you here is that our focus has strongly been on manaaki taio, care and respect of our environment. It's been about our planet, and it's been about our profits. We're now approaching the end of this conference, and it would be remiss of us to finish up without bringing to the table the people element of sustainability, the triple bottom line, people, planet and profit. Along the way on our journey on these past 2 days, we've had snippets of reference, particularly from Anahira and Niraj, about the just transition, and this session is about that. A just transition is a key part of sustainability. It relates to the way we transition to a net zero carbon society. And in the words of the Honourable James Shaw, a just transition means transitioning in a way that is fair and equitable, that leaves no community, no family and no person behind. When we couple this with climate change action and specifically decarbonisation, we begin to wonder what it looks like here in New Zealand. And just to help get you in the mindset, I'm going to turn your mind to 3 scenarios. First of all, think back to the early years of European settlement in New Zealand and the gold rush throughout central Otago. Small villages and towns popped up to support those miners in their quest to get rich and enable them to plunder the landscape for small treasures. People lived in harsh climates with little or no food, clothing or shelter, with many perishing or giving up and heading off to find more fruitful work elsewhere. And when it was all over, what happened? All we need to do is look at Arrowtown in central Otago, at the historic shanty huts that still remain in their desolate state. The towns, the shacks, left empty, and communities and families disintegrated as people moved on and left to go on their own search for things elsewhere. I want you to think about that and think about the likes of the west coast of the South Island, Southland and various North Island communities established many years ago to mine coal, enabling New Zealand's mobility, to warm our homes and operate our industrial boilers. When we apply that gold rush story with coal mining, we start to look at how shifting away from the use of coal has the potential to destroy the livelihoods not only of those coal miners, but their families and the towns and communities, as well as all the businesses associated with them. Our question is not whether or not we should find a way to keep coal. That's not where I'm going with this. The question is, how do we look after those people, those communities, as we transition to a low carbon world? And what is the role of government and businesses? What will those communities look like come 2050? So in this session today, you're going to hear from our panellists their views on what we could look for to identify social vulnerability in our transition, what the roles are of businesses, unions and governments, the challenges in getting our boards and investors to buy in to finance a just transition, and here's some examples of what a just transition approach looks like through the lens of their businesses. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. On stage today, we have Kirk Hope. Kirk is the Chief Executive of Business New Zealand, New Zealand's leading business advocacy group. Kirk and his Wellington-based team work with companies, organisations and political and other decision makers advocating for New Zealand's success through sustainable economic growth. Kirk has previously held leadership positions with the New Zealand Bankers Association, the Financial Services Federation and Westpac New Zealand. He has represented Business New Zealand on official 2018 Tax Working Group, the 2018 Fair Pay Agreements Working Group, the Future of Work Tripartite Forum, and is a commission member of the Tertiary Education Commission and a member of the Defence Employers Support Council. Welcome, Kirk. We also have, to his left, is Louise Aitken. Louise is the Executive Partner for Circular and Climate Innovation and Sustainability for Toyota New Zealand. Louise is supporting and enabling and accelerating Toyota's contribution to a low-emission society, focusing on product stewardship, innovation, and building a foundation of sustainable practice based in science. Louise joined Toyota following 4 years as the Chief Executive Officer of the Arkina Foundation. She has a wealth of knowledge, influence, and is a highly regarded leader and innovator in the areas of social and environmental impact. Welcome. And on the far end, we have Annie Newman. Annie is an Assistant National Secretary for ETU, the largest private sector union in Aotearoa, representing over 45,000 workers from most sectors of the economy, including energy, property, services, care work, aviation, manufacturing and mining. ETU has been at the forefront of union engagement in the plan for post-oil exploration, Taranaki 2050 roadmap, and currently Annie leads a just transition strategy for ETU in Southland, where uncertainty continues over the fate of the Tiwai aluminium smelter. Annie is on the governance board of the Living Wage Movement and on its principal partner council, which is comprised of employers championing the living wage in different sectors of the economy. She is also chair of a trust that is overseeing the formation of a new community alliance for Auckland, Te Ahu Whakawhanauna. I was getting there. Tamaki Makaurau. So welcome. I think a just transition is a very interesting topic. And before we dive into some of the conversations that we're going to have, I actually want to hear from each of you what a just transition means to you. Kirk.
Well, for me personally, it means that my kids and grandkids can have the type of life that I've had in New Zealand, living here for my entire life. So if we have a just transition, they'll be able to enjoy what we have been able to enjoy.
Fantastic. Louise?
I'd probably expand that a little bit more. It's not just Kirk's kids or his grandkids or my child. It's all children. I think we have to reframe what we mean by the term just transition. And actually what I've found over these last 48 hours is really insightful when you raised it during your opening, is that we've spent a lot of time talking about carbon. I think everyone can probably recognise that. And we have a real risk that our climate response will be focused on carbon. And carbon is a part of what we need to deal with. We have got to a point, and we haven't really mentioned it apart from a couple of the panels where we've spoken about ESG, and I think the risk that we've currently got is the E is actually a C, to be honest, and the S is too confronting, and for us to actually have a proper conversation about what inequality is in our communities. COVID didn't cause inequality, and climate certainly did not. It's just put a massive spotlight on it, and that's really, really hard to deal with, particularly in our own communities and probably starting at our own organisations and the communities in which we operate. And then I think G is focused on risk, so it's really an R. And so what I find interesting about looking at it through the lens of a just transition is the interconnection between the E and the S and the G is what's most important. We've got to put Papatūānuku and people at the heart of our climate response in order to be able to take this opportunity of this massive investment that we need to do, both financially, mentally, and collectively, to actually develop the community that we all deserve and particularly the community that we want to hand off to our children and our mokopuna. Because if we don't, as Mike said, we will not be able to respond. We will not get to 2050 apart from those who can afford it. And that's really frightening. And I think we have to be really honest about that. And I haven't necessarily heard over these last 48 hours a conversation on that, which should have been in every panel. So I'm glad we're doing it now.
Thank you. Clearly a huge round of agreement there.
Yeah. I think it was a nice place to start with people. I think that's important. I think it's worth remembering that the term just transition came from the trade union movement in the United States, and it emerged some decades ago in response to the loss of jobs in the fossil fuel industry as a result of climate change decisions about regulation because of climate change. So it's had a strong origin in working people and their organisations in the States. And so for me, it really is about what happens to the lives of people now who are being impacted by big decisions around industry, whether that's the Tiwai smelter or offshore drilling or New Zealand Steel and the many, many others that are being challenged at the moment. And so what happens to those people and what happens to their families and the communities that are left behind in that process? So it's putting the just or the justice back into the upheavals that will take place as we transition.
Well said, thank you. Kirk, I'm going to go to you for the first question. So if you're thinking about New Zealand from the top of the North Island all the way down to Stewart Island and out across to Chatham Island, what do we need to look for to identify those who are most vulnerable socially to our transition to net zero?
Yeah, it was interesting. I had written a few notes down before Mike spoke, and broadly I'm in agreement with what he says around the localisation picture. So making sure you have a because each locality will have different types of vulnerability and different types of opportunity actually as well. It's important to focus on that because again that can be a way to reduce vulnerability going forward. But I think if we look at within a just transition, a component of a just transition has to be an equitable transition, right? So you've got to look at some of those issues around equity which exist in regional localities and then figure out where you can invest, I think, for longer term resilience, which means doing some really smart things around enabling businesses within those localities to start to grow in a different way. So that would be my observations on that.
So, Louise?
Not surprising, I'll just add to that. A couple of challenges in that question in itself. When we say we need to look, like why do we need to look? Why don't we ask the communities themselves what they want? Listen to them. We heard that with Anahira yesterday, who was just inspiring. Just get out of the way. It's not our job to solve communities' problems. They can solve their own problems, and they need to be enabled and empowered to be able to do that. So I think businesses, particularly everyone sitting here, needs to figure out what are you going to contribute to that? How can your offering add value to them, not for your own benefit? And I think that by doing that and putting the power into those communities themselves, we will see innovation, we will see community strength. And we saw that through the lens of COVID. The minute we trusted particularly Māori communities to respond, the magic happened. If we don't learn from that, shame on us. So I also have an issue with the term vulnerability, the vulnerable, who defines that? So let's be really honest about what we're asking communities to do and how can we help them to find the solutions that are right for them. And if we do that, we're responding well as a partner to them rather than instructing them on how we think their problem can be solved, because often we don't listen well.
Yeah, I think if we want to identify vulnerability, we should look at the workforce that's impacted. And in that sense, Kirk's really right that there's a locality issue. There's what's happening in the direct workforce that's impacted. But more than that, what's happening with the supply chain and the adjacent workforces that are often far bigger. So if you look at something like Tiwai and you see 800 odd workers, there's another 3,000 who are directly impacted by any change or upheaval in their industry. But there's also a reality there's a kind of a tension with the national situation, which is that if you look at big upheavals in the 1980s, they really disproportionately affected Māori and Pacifica. If you look at the adjacent industries to those that are being threatened, you're seeing large numbers of women, because often those adjacent industries involve cleaning, catering, laundry services, all of those other support services. And so we've seen very inequitable transitions in the past when they've not been managed transitions, and we're at risk of seeing race and gender inequities emerging. So I think we need to look both to location but also to the experience in the past of what's happened when particularly vulnerable or precarious workforces have experienced the downsides of those transitions.
Can I just add to that, because I think it's really important, because one of the things that happened was people got trapped within communities which were where resources were becoming scarcer and scarcer and scarcer, and so a just transition looks like the exact opposite of that. To your point, Lou, it's around empowering those communities, but we have to, I mean, our contribution to that is at a framework, well, from a Business New Zealand perspective, is at a framework, at a policy perspective, and thinking about how we can help and enable our members to think like that, to your point, Lou, as well. So I'd just add that.
Okay, thank you. What do you believe, Annie, I might start with you, what do you believe the role of government is in a just transition?
I, just even drawing on the recent experience of Southland, I don't think it's possible for what in some ways is a quite fractured civil society to deliver big change without a framework that's a managed and guided framework. So I think that there's a really important balance that has to be achieved here between the sphere, if you like, of government, of civil society and of the market where business is operating. I think that that's something that we have to work hard at in Aotearoa. I don't think that it exists, and in order to get it to a place where there's a confidence that each of those spheres has a role to play, there needs to be a managed and guided process, and to some extent a funded process, because I don't think people can participate. I don't think we'll get the voices of working people in their communities if they're not supported financially to be doing that.
That's a really good point. Lou, what about unions? And yes, I'm intentionally asking you before I go to Annie. What do you believe their role is?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy with Annie sitting here that I answer that, but
That's okay.
always have an opinion. Always have an opinion. I think there is a massive role for unions, for that collective voice and being able to take those who may not feel confident in participating in a very difficult conversation on their own, even in small groups, where the power imbalance is so obvious. And I think that the unions, and particularly over our history, and not just here in Aotearoa, but if you look at the UK, if you look at other markets where the unions have represented those who did not have a voice. And I think that we have to strengthen that. We have to listen to that voice, and we have to enable, and exactly what Annie said is that for those to participate will come in different ways. It might be monetary, it might be time, it might be a different way of engaging, and I think the unions can help guide that through a single voice in a way that maybe individual communities don't have the access or the ability to leverage in the same way. Did I pass?
Yeah, I thought that was great. I could just add to it a little.
Of course.
I think that I think what Kirk was talking about in terms of sort of the policy, the framing up of critical issues is a role that unions can play, and how we define what decent work looks like. How do we set a standard for work in the future in new industries? I think that we need to be clear about what that means. And there are many frameworks around decent work, so it's an international term that's used, good and fair work, but it talks about incomes and security and the quality of workplaces and their environment, and it talks about the way people have a voice. So I think all of those things are really important in it. But there's actually another role that unions play alongside Business New Zealand, and that's it. And that's in the sort of collaboration or the creating a collective response. Because I don't think that we can do it on our own. I don't think any of us can do it on our own. We have to be working together and coming to some kind of consensus so that we can shift the dial on this thing, which is so much greater than any of us as individuals or organisations.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned before, Annie, about funding. So there's a lot of businesses in the room who have boards and investors. Kirk, I'm just going to ask you, what challenges do you see we have in getting boards and investors to buy into funding a just transition?
Well, in many ways, if they're thinking about investment for resilience, they'll already be thinking about what that looks like, because of course it will mean that there will be a skilled and available workforce within the communities within which they're hoping to operate. So if they're not thinking about that, they're probably not going to be sustainable, right? I think there are other areas where boards will be starting to have to think about the whole transition process. So their role in mitigation, and you've seen, clearly the Climate Leaders Coalition making commitments in relation to mitigation. There'll be where companies are starting to think about what their role might be in adaptation and the capital and the people that they need to undertake some of their role in that adaptation and investing for resilience, as I described. And then they'll be thinking about what they need by way of certainty from a policy framework, and we've all referred to that, so that they can continue to invest and continue to make those investments. So those will be the critical things where I think you're seeing some pretty significant commitments from boards, and those will increase, I think, to Mike's point, if they don't increase significantly, we'll end up on the blue line, which I don't think any of us want to be at. In fact, we're not sustainable.
I'll probably just add from an investor standpoint. I was lucky to be on the board of New Zealand's first impact investing fund, and we spent a lot of time raising that fund. We raised just under 10 million of private capital, and a lot of the conversation at the time, and thankfully now the market's moved on, was educating on what impact was, first of all, to even get the wallet opened for the investment. And I find it exciting to think that now, we've got TCFD, and it's, I nearly cried when the zero carbon bill came through, because I never thought I'd be so excited about a whole bunch of letters that identified climate risk. Who would have thought? But I knew, and many of the people in the room knew, what that would mean for the flow of capital. So that's great, climate risk. We're now starting to hear and have a conversation about nature risk, great. Let's be really excited about when it becomes a social risk. And what do we need to do to be able to measure and manage and invest and enhance social impact? That's really hard, because you can't often get a financial calculation on what is deeply social. But it will be exciting to give it a go. And I think as investors, we need to start thinking about that. As directors, we need to start thinking about what our own S is and asking those questions at the board table. Often the S needs to start from within. What's our own fair pay, well-being focus of our own people within our own employment and then into our supply chains? And if we do that well and with the support around measurement and actually getting to impact, not counting widgets, that's when we're going to start to see the true value of money, and for us to value what we value, not a financial return first. Because one of the best quotes I've heard in a long time is, we don't live in an economy, we live in a society. So let's use our economy to get there, not the other way around. The economy is not the destination. So that's what I'm excited about, seeing the power of what the financial system, particularly, can do to deliver social impact. It's still a very long way off.
Yeah, I think that the social impact, or the S in the ESG, is an incredibly important one. And on the Principal Partner Council of the Living Wage Movement, which is comprised of businesses, about 5 corporates are being very clear that the living wage trademark is a way in which you can name your commitment to the social corporate responsibility. And that includes Westpac, AMP Wealth Capital, Kiwibank, Vector. So, and many of the others are doing that because they see that as a way of naming the social commitment that they make for the investors that they are trying to attract.
Awesome. I think that's quite a good challenge for everybody to think about their own businesses in that way as well. So just before we wrap up, because we've got about 5 minutes to go, I'd just like to hear from each of you maybe an example of what the Just Transition approach looks like through the lens of your own business or organisation that you work for. Lou?
Is this the last time we're going to speak before the time's up?
Hopefully not.
Okay. I might do the mic drop at the end then.
Okay.
No surprise to anyone who knows me. Yeah, I mean, I'm really, really excited about our ability to deliver to deliver the support we can to the communities to thrive. It's really hard. I'm really, really proud of a piece of work that has kind of carried with me for the last few years around bringing low emission vehicles to low income families. It is and will be hard for a long time because it's so complex. You can't have one entity try and do that. We managed to get Toyota through a phone call to Neeraj, who just said yes when I said, can we have a bunch of cars? But we knew we had to have a community organisation who was deeply trusted by the people at the heart of that solution, through Muma in South Auckland, and Ākina, who knew deeply impact. But sitting behind that was an impact investor, 3 government agencies, a local government, massive amount of officials who were deeply committed, and it was like herding cats. But the impact of it can be so significant because not only are we changing the way people interact with transport and giving them the power for being part of the just transition from an energy standpoint and a transport standpoint, but deeply we're enabling them to participate financially in our economy, because not only did they have a reduction of bill shock because the car that they got was fully serviced, had a WAF, tyres can change and no cost, all of those things that keep people trapped in poverty by bill shock. They also saved a lot of money because it was a hybrid. So suddenly you can have multiple benefits by bringing together a group of organisations deeply focused on improving and supporting what the community want themselves. But no, it takes a lot of time and effort, and it's still got a long way to go. And I think if we do that well and we're honest about how hard it is and we're honest about who needs to be in the room and who needs to have the voice in the room, we can make real change, and we should celebrate that and accelerate it more. And I challenge every business to think, what's your contribution to something like that? Because you are not going to have a corporate social responsibility program that delivers all of it. Because you need to make better decisions in your supply chain and what you're doing and all of that stuff. Allow the communities to get on and do what they need to do, and that's exciting. So I want more of that.
Excellent. Kirk?
I will just use a couple of examples. So we're involved, as Annie said, and as you said in your introduction, in the Tripartite Future Work Forum. There's a bunch of work streams in there. Obviously, it's not just about the future work, but it's primarily about the future work. In there, we have a stream around just transitions, and one of the pieces of work that we've done recently as recently as yesterday is look at some of the things from a policy perspective that have been done with communities like Taranaki and like Southland, where the purpose of those frameworks were to help bring people together, to help underpin some of the decision making with resources, and to help enable those communities to make decisions that will make them more resilient for the future. So what we do through the forum is interrogate those processes and find out where the gaps are and where we might be looking next to fit a framework. Now, again, those frameworks are defined by the local communities and the local businesses thinking about their futures and whether they have a future in some particular instances. The great news is, frankly, the examples out of Taranaki and Southland are plethora. The opportunities are looking, pretty good for those communities, but it's not without its extreme challenges. So we want to continue to be heavily involved in that work. We're in that forum with the CTU and the government as the tripartite partners. There is also a subcommittee that Māori contribute to for the forum, and again, that's bringing in that component of an equitable transition. So those are just some practical examples of where we're involved.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that's all we have time for today because we've run out of time in our session. But I wish to thank our panellists, Kirk, Louise and Annie, and I know Lou wants to do a mic drop, so I'll give her a sec. But I just want to thank them for their contribution and thought leadership. And also thank you guys for your engaged listening today and wish you well in your application of a just transition in your business. So, Lou.
So just very quickly, I'll take the opportunity anytime I can. We are all believers, because we're all in the disco, on zero carbon and zero carbon to 2050. My challenge is, what's the equivalent for the society that we want in 2050? What is that hero statement, and how can we collectively come up with that? Because I hope in a year's time, we're not just talking about zero carbon 2050. We're talking about the community that we want in 2050 and how it can be thriving in a zero carbon economy. We have to reframe what our focus is, and at the moment we're too focused on carbon, and I think we need to take a step back and put communities and Papatūānuku in the middle of that, and maybe next year it's not just zero carbon 2050 we're talking about.
Awesome. Thank you.